Welcome. I'm Katrina Jackson, the Leah Jellin Poorview Executive Director of the Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America and the librarian for the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. This afternoon's program is the opening event of the exhibition Cooking Up Change, Women's Agency and Community Building Through Cookbooks. This program features Angela Sanfilippo, President of the Gloucester Fishermen's Wives Association, Marylène Altieri, former curator of books and published materials at the Schlesinger Library, and the exhibition curator, Erin LaBove. Drawn from the Schlesinger Library's extensive collection of more than 4,300 community cookbooks, Cooking Up Change explores the history and cultural significance of community cookbooks spanning the 19th through the 21st centuries. The collection showcases the efforts of women's groups within a variety of organizations to raise funds for their religious, educational, and civic causes while also documenting the social and cultural history of their varied communities and culinary traditions. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors watching this program. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. We also gratefully acknowledge the Helen Blumen and Jan Acton Fund for Schlesinger Library exhibitions for their support. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions at any time during the program, and the speakers will address as many as they can. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them short. This will enable as many as possible to be answered in the time we have. Please keep an eye on the chat feature of the webinar, where we will post a registration link to view the exhibition in person or to schedule a group or class tour. It is now my pleasure to give the virtual floor to my colleague and the curator of this exhibition, Erin LaBove.
Hi, thank you, Katrina, for the introduction. And thank you to Angela and Marylène for being here today. Before we get started, I wanted to provide a brief overview of the exhibit and community cookbooks in general, just to give some context for our discussion. In addition to curating the exhibit, I'm the library's cataloger for published materials and have been working with community cookbooks for over a decade. And I'm very excited for the opportunity to highlight this specific type of cookbook and show how published materials can be primary sources that hold a wealth of cultural and social information. So you may not be familiar with the term community cookbooks, but there's probably a good chance you've come across one in a family member's kitchen or maybe at a thrift store. You might also think of them as church cookbooks. Also known as charity or fundraising cookbooks, community cookbooks are compiled and sold to raise funds for various causes and are particularly popular among religious organizations. With the introduction of specialty publishers and their cookbook templates in the 1930s and 1940s, it became easier and much more accessible for organizations to create their own fundraising cookbooks. So just about any kind of group or organization you could think of has made one. So like including hospital auxiliaries, schools, animal welfare, animal welfare organizations, women's clubs, associations, and shelters. They are pieces of social and cultural history that can tell us what kind of organizations existed, who was in them, what they thought was important, what local businesses existed through advertisements that they had in them, which ingredients were available, used, and popular, and of course, what recipes people were excited to share. So in most cases, these cookbooks are the result of the diligent work of women's organizations or women's committees within larger organizations. As shown through archival materials in one area of the exhibit, groups such as the Women's Educational and Industrial Union and the Gloucester Fishermen's Wives Association brainstormed, planned, and reached out to members for recipes, photos, and stories. They worked with publishers and printers to compile and create these cookbooks, then came up with marketing and sales plans to meet their fundraising goals. Each one of these cookbooks represents the work of women and give insights into the communities they are a part of. So with this context in mind, let's start our discussion on community cookbooks from the viewpoints of a member of a women's organization and a curator curator of a special collections library. So I'm going to start off with a question for Angela. Um, so Angela, what made the Fishermen's Wives decide to make a cookbook in the first place?
Um, it was back in 1969 when the Gloucester Fisherman's Wife came together. And the reason they did was because back then, the Atlantic Ocean was open to the whole world. We only had 12-mile jurisdiction. And then the whole world was fishing behind that 12 miles to the point that they saw their husband making the trip longer and longer because they couldn't catch enough fish. And also because the only thing was being used was haddock, cod, lobster, flounder, and everything else that came on the deck of a boat was being thrown out. Being of Italian Sicilian, connection, that they knew all the recipes for all these other fish that people were scared even to look at them. So they decided to create a cookbook because they wanted more than ever, they want the public to eat different type of seafood. So we don't have to put all the efforts on haddock and cod and flounder and lobsters. I wasn't with them, as I said, but they wrote the recipes. They knew what to do, but they did not know how to do a cookbook. So through one of the people that was attending the meeting, they got in touch with the League of Women's Voters here in Gloucester, and the league got them, just get us the recipes, we will do the cookbook. So they did the recipes, they tested them. There was a test kitchen here in Gloucester back then, and then they were made perfect, and the cookbook was created. But behind the creation of the cookbook was the advocacy that the women were doing with government and state regulations, all kind of, because all this was new after Magnuson-Stevens Act that was passed in 76, but did not get to be effective until 77.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question before going over to Marylène, because a lot of these kind of like flowed into one conversation. So I think you just touched on it anyway, but if you want to go into more detail about how the organization went about compiling the cookbook, like how they got the recipes and the stories and the photographs.
The recipe came from the Fisherman's Wife, the different individual people. They don't have their name attached to any of them. But there was one of the old members when we were talking about this, she would say, well, we had to measure everything because we learned from my mother a little bit of this and a little bit of this, and it was fine, but we had no clue. I'll measure it, and make sure that it tastes the same all the time. And they had lots of fun in doing so. And because later we started doing cooking demonstration in different places, food markets, school, anybody who wanted us, we would go and cook some of the stuff that is there to encourage them to say, you see, this is not headache, but this is just as good. And we encounter so many people who were only said, oh, no, 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 I only eat haddock. Pollock, no. So but the people were saying, like, how are we going to get these people to, I says, tell them that it's haddock. And they will come back and say, oh my God, I never had a piece of fish like this. This is so good. So, it was an education. And if you see today, we did squid, we did pollock, we did catfish, we did all these recipes that came from their home or their grandmother back in Sicily, because that's how they ate everything. It is not just one or two things. Plus, they made sure they enclosed recipe from the Portuguese community and also from the Finland community and also for the Yankee community as well. So and then every time we had, we had to go to print, we will have additional recipes to the point that it was just being too much. Maybe we want to do another cookbook. But the last printing we did, what we updated mostly was there's a page dedicated for the Gloucester Fisherman's Wife of today and the League of Women's Voter of today. So now it really carries what I'm talking about. It's already in that one page that was done.
That's great. I love like all the different like international communities that have come together to be like represented here. So I'm going to move on to Marylène for 2 questions next. So Marylène, could you speak on the importance of community cookbooks in general and their place in a special collections research library, Schlesinger?
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak about this subject that's still very interesting to me, even 3.5 years into retirement. But going back to when I began at Schlesinger, and excuse me if I repeat some of what you said, because I have brought up some of the same points that you made, Erin, about the meaning of these books. But I was very quickly initiated to the importance of the community cookbooks by my predecessor, Barbara Haber, and by Barbara Ketchum-Wheaton, who was the honorary curator of the culinary collection. So I learned from both Barbaras how this collection meshed with the broader holdings of Schlesinger, documenting the work of women during the 19th and 20th centuries. So there are plenty of examples of men putting out community cookbooks, but they have been and continue to be largely produced by women. So they sit squarely at the intersection of food history and women's history. Though the women's movements of the 19th and 20th century are said to have contributed to women moving away from the kitchen, there were even community cookbooks put out by many suffrage organizations, and you have one in the exhibition that's also part of the slideshow, so folks will see that in the slideshow. And even the National Organization for Women put out a community cookbook. So as you said, they are also known as charitable cookbooks since they were fundraising tools. The very earliest example that I know of from 1863 was produced by women who were raising funds for the care of the wounded and dying in the United States Civil War. In producing these books, the women's organizations in churches, synagogues, clubs, social welfare organizations, and businesses and other areas were acting both as guardians of family and local traditions, building on their own domestic experiences, and as successful organizers of publishing and fundraising. No one would dispute that women knew how to cook and how to write recipes. But back when women were not believed to have the skills or the fortitude to do challenging work in business or in the professions, they showed tremendous executive ability right from the start and marketing skills with community cookbooks, which raised very substantial sums of money that built or benefited houses of worship, schools, hospitals, and social services of all kinds. So the community cookbooks really embody these attainments of women before they got the vote, even, and before they began to be in the workforce in large numbers. So these humble books are important in a special collections library because they are chock full of valuable information of researchers, as you highlighted, Erin. The recipes themselves record cooking practices and techniques, the variety of available ingredients and products, the social function of food preparation in families and social groups, the technology of the kitchen and the pantry, the traditions of generations of families, ethnic, racial, and religious groups, and of immigrant communities. Many community cookbooks include a history of the organization or the sponsoring body and details about the role that women played in them. The names of the recipe contributors offer opportunities for genealogical and social history research. Many organizations, such as the Gloucester Fishermen's Organization, have issued multiple cookbooks over the years, which is a key to studying the evolution of their communities. And in the future, I can even imagine that community cookbooks will be used to document ingredients and dishes that have vanished due to climate change or diasporas or world conflict.
Thank you so much. I got another question for you that's going to follow up on this and touch on what you were just talking about too. So like we've both said, community cookbooks represent 2 of Schlesinger Library's collecting areas, women's history and culinary history. How did this factor into your decisions on which community cookbooks to add to the collection?
Right. Well, for all our efforts to document women's lives, there are many women who did not leave behind papers or records. The community cookbook might be the only evidence of their efforts and existence. So the older titles seemed the most important to preserve and the most difficult to collect as well. They could be expensive, fragile, in need of conservation work, but they were more likely to reflect very local practices and traditions and to be issued by women's groups for which we might not have any other kind of documentation. Often, these books included blank pages on which women could record additional recipes of their own or paste in recipes from friends or magazines. So I looked for those particularly, and you have examples of this in the current exhibition. One of my favorites was a book from Milwaukee where the printed recipes are all in English, but the added recipes on the blank pages are all written in German. And there was also a bilingual community cookbook, such as the one from the Midwest published in the 1890s, sometimes that has parallel columns in Finnish and English. So that type of cookbook was the kind of thing I was looking more for. From the mid-20th century forward, community cookbooks begin to become somewhat more generic. And with many more women working outside the home, they were perhaps less unique in documenting women's lives. And they also became a favorite collectible for many individuals. So consequently, we were being offered all these very large personal collections as gifts. We did sometimes find hidden treasures among those gifts, but I didn't need to devote resources to collecting in that time period because they were just coming to us naturally. So I tried as much as possible to focus on purchasing the titles from earlier years that were unlikely to be given as gifts and that were also unlikely to be held in other libraries. And as time went on, libraries began to digitize their holdings. So I also tried to find cookbooks that were not available in digital form. At one point, I realized that we had very little from Spanish-speaking immigrant communities, and there were very few of those available digitally either. So I purchased quite a few of those, and even some from Mexico that were so closely related to Mexican-American foodways. I also looked for cookbooks from East and South Asian and other more recent immigrant communities in America that weren't already in the Schlesinger holdings. And then finally, I became aware that some cookbooks were documenting cooking traditions that were being affected by climate change, such as the recipes of Inuit populations that are found in the famous Eskimo cookbook that depended on the permafrost or on the availability of fish and wild game that were endangered. So I sought out that type of book. There's a historic example of one of those in the exhibit, and of course, Angela's group has focused on this also.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna go back to Angela now with a question. You did touch on this a bit with your other responses with the League of Women Voters. So like within this, expand on that. But how did the process of creating the cookbook help strengthen ties within your own organization, or help foster lasting relationships outside of the organization within the local community or with other local groups such as the Women Voters?
Well, as I said earlier, when they did this, I wasn't there. I'm repeating what they taught us, how that got done. And yes, brought the group really together. And the funny thing that I heard was that, like, if someone put in a recipe, they wanted to really know that they were that person gave the recipe to be listed on the cookbook. It became a lot of, believe it or not, like I said earlier, became a lot of fun because everywhere we went and doing cooking demonstration, people would gather in such an enormous numbers and they bought the cookbook, and plus they waited until they could taste it, and they wanted to know what page is this recipe. So the cookbook has always been, as I say sometimes, it's the passport to Gloucester, because we have printed so many. I cannot tell you how many times we have printed, and we print by thousands, and they sell. I mean, I also think it's one of the cheapest cookbook, but the experience of today of people who are trying the new thing, the fish is not new, but try new way of tasting different fish is really giving. It's kind of funny because wherever I go, people say, "Oh, I have that cookbook. Oh, I have that cookbook." Anyway, it's so, like I said, and we're still selling it. And with the 2 pages that we put in, people are really taking the time, because sometimes I get emails, people thanking us for putting the cookbook together, and they want to know if it's still alive, if they can buy some. A lot of the touristy little stores, they sell them very in large amounts. So it is like, if there was a problem, let's cook up something. Let's get the cookbook and cook something up so people feel that they all belong into this.
I love that. Like, I was in Gloucester recently and I saw that cookbook in several places. So that was great. I don't eat fish, so I didn't buy it, but I have looked through it a lot and I love it. But it's great that it still sells.
You can replace some of those recipes with, let's say, with chicken or whatever. It's all the ingredients are just that they ask for the recipes. They're fresh vegetables, fresh fish, and fresh cheese and milk when we do the batters. It's and even though it's written in the cookbook, each one of us are at our own way of using the cookbook for different things. But like I said, every time we do something, it goes, and people do buy the cookbook. And basically, at that time, the fisherman's wife had no money of anything. They just came together, and people did not have money to, you really thinking of printing them on their own there, but it was the selling of the cookbook that also put out the 20 years that took us to do the Gloucester Fisherman's Wife Memorial. I was going through some old paper this weekend, and I found what was all the donor, and the Gloucester Fisherman's Wife was $20,000 that they had by selling cookbook to jumpstart the, like the Gloucester Fisherman's Wife Memorial. And it's one of the things that people get kind of, how do they do these things? How can they eat this type of fish? And we finally, we are convincing people that if it's not pollock, but it's cod, or if not gray sole, but yellowback, it's people have accepted more and more to try all the other species. But because in doing the cookbook, I think we also done a lot of hard work in protecting the environment. And it's our belief that if the large public tried to cook some of these fish and eat them, then we can take the pressure off the haddock and the cod and the flounder. And so it's at this point in my life, when I do a presentation, I keep saying, this is what we're doing. What are you gonna do after we are not there no more? So it's like I said, it's unbelievable how many people we have really taught, and they feel, like you said, they feel part of the organization. And in the last 10, 15 years, when they do the Boston Seafood Festival, we give out sample of different species that they are in the cookbook, like fish cakes, monkfish soup, redfish soup, calamari in all different forms. Fish cakes, it always goes big. And then people want to buy it, and we just tell them, no, we're giving them out to taste. So why did you let me try? I cannot get it anywhere. So I said, go buy the fish and do it yourself. Oh, it's not that easy. But it was funny. This past summer, somebody called me and he said, I finally was able to get some monkfish. And you told me the recipe, but I don't remember. So do you mind? So I gave him the recipe. I says, could you let me know how you make out? And he called back and he says, it was wonderful. So the public is that willing to try, but it's where it comes, not all fish market carry some of these species, much, much more than before, but still, so the people say, well, you make me taste it if I cannot buy it anywhere.
Oh yeah, that's wonderful. It kind of reminds me of during like World War II, when all the cookbooks and stuff are trying to be like use all the parts of the animal and all the parts of this because we have to like send off food for rations and everything. So it's like really interesting that as like not being like a war aspect, but being of like an environmental aspect and not having things like overfished, like you should eat everything. So that it's really wonderful to see like that
Well,
still going.
I've been told by the older people that during World War II, the boats were fishing nonstop because they were using the fish to send to the troops all over the world. I don't think it's like that anymore, but that, this is what they said. They were, really producing as much as possible. And whatever fish they got, they were selling to the troops.
Wow. So Mike, I have another question. We're going to go right back to Marylène now. Let's see. So this one is, did collecting community cookbooks lead to any ongoing relationships with book dealers, community groups, or individuals that were beneficial to building the collection, or lead to any interesting acquisitions you might not otherwise have come across?
Well, yes, indeed. There were numerous dealers who specialized in this material, and they had had a relationship with Schlesinger Library before I arrived. So I continued working with them, and they were terrific folks with whom I really, really enjoyed working and very knowledgeable. But there were also non-culinary dealers who dealt in books and printed materials on women's history and activism and related historical material, which was actually the main focus of my work at the library. So I kind of let them know that we were also interested in any community cookbooks they might come across that these groups of women's activists and other political groups might have produced. And I was amazed by some of the wonderful and unusual offerings we began to get from them. There was one dealer in San Francisco in particular who unearthed all sorts of material that he had never dealt in before either, because he hadn't made the connection in his mind about how important those types of materials would be in a women's history library. So that was kind of a discovery process, and I got in the habit of telling all the book dealers that I was interested in this kind of material. So I also discovered the whole world of alternative DIY publications such as zines, some of which were recipe compilations similar to community cookbooks, but for very particular communities, the queer community or whatever, or the vegan community. Before the commercial world of book publishing began to pick up on vegan cuisine, some of the first vegan cookbooks I found were these little compilations, do-it-yourself compilations of zines. Earlier, I mentioned Barbara Wheaton and Barbara Haber as people who influenced me greatly, but another person who inspired and educated me a great deal about community cookbooks was the late book dealer and curator Janice Bluestein Longone, who developed the culinary collection at the University of Michigan, which has a very significant community cookbook collection. And she very generously and kindly shared her vast knowledge of community cookbooks and other culinary materials with me. It was a very friendly world. Other culinary librarians became regular correspondents with me. And among the dealers, so there were some dealers who did outstanding work in documenting the historic cookbooks. For example, Don Lindgren of Rabelais Books. And he and several other dealers/scholars sent many fascinating, well-documented listings my way and taught me a lot. And finally, I must mention and thank the Culinary Historians of Boston, which is a group that was begun in the 1980s by Barbara Wheaton and others, and that met at Schlesinger Library for years. And they were a tremendous help and resource in building our collection and finding unusual items.
Oh, that's great. Thanks so much. Angela, I have one last question for you, and then after that, we'll have one last question for Marylène, and then we'll move on to Q&A. So, Angela, you did talk about this a little bit, and I think I know what your answer is going to be. But how is creating and selling the cookbook an effective marketing and fundraising tool for your organization? And do you feel the effort was worth it? Because obviously, a lot of effort did go into this.
Well, the effort was very well worth it. Like I say, did the cookbook create a financial support for the organization? But it was when they started to think about, or I was with them, to think about doing the memorial, that basically we set aside $20,000 from our organization to be spent for the memorial, to create the memorial, which was duplicated by many people in the community. You know, it was a big expense, but very well. When I talk about big expense, I'm talking about the memorial. But the people just loved it, and they still love it. And so when you even talk about the memorial, we also bring in the cookbook, because everything comes together. And it just, was very well worth doing it. And as I said before, it still sells. It's one of those books that they really sell in here and out of town. We shared that with the league. We're in good support, know each other. And the other thing I forgot to tell you is that then in 2005, we worked with some people and we created another cookbook. It's called, I'm just going to show you. I don't know if you get to see this. Is it blurry? Okay. It's called Gloucester Fisherman's Wife Cookbooks, Stories and Recipe. It documents the history of 18 women who were members of the organization, and they got out there, they really got to do this work, and then they attached their family recipe on each person. And we did not have the copyright to this book, even though we did, but the person has passed away with the copyrights and donated the copyrights to the Gloucester Fisherman's Wife Association. So we're going to start looking at how we can reprint it, because here again, that is wonderful recipe, and it's not just on fish, but other things as well, and pastry, and also it's pastry. So it's, as I said earlier, we always say the cookbook, it's a passport to Gloucester, because people buy, they also send it for gift to around the country. So at some point, those people, when they come, they were one time they were looking for the Gloucester Fisherman's Wife restaurant, because they said, you cannot have a book like this and don't sell the ingredients of the fish. But the last 40 years has really been difficult at doing things outside of the fishing regulations, because we never knew, and we still don't, how many people would be left at the end of this road. And so they're selling, like I said before, now they getting a good price for pollock, good price for squid. Back then it was like 10 cents a pound when the woman wrote the cookbook. I remember my father coming in from a long trip and find out, oh, today the price was decent. How much? 12 cents a pound for haddock and cod and stuff like that. There was the quantity, and only because they had lots of people to fish. Every boat the bigger boat, they would take like 8 people. The middle boats would take 5 people, and the little ones would take 3 people. Well, many of our fishermen today are fishing alone on the small boats, because they cannot find good crew, which we know. We do encourage our kids not to go fishing, but go get an education. And so they did. But some of them have come back to say, what can I do to really put value on this whole thing? But it's hard. It's really hard. But we do once a year, we do a fish day at the State House, in our local State House, where we have all different people bringing food, or, oysters, mussel, everything. And people go nuts. And what they say is, why can't we go to a restaurant and eat something like this? So maybe we need to look for a restaurant as well. And but it's not easy, but it's been and it still is very much worth doing what we did.
Thank you so much. I love just the utter longevity of that project and really how worthwhile it was in so many aspects. So we've got one last question for Marylène. And you touched on this one too, but I'm just going to ask it anyway. So were there any challenges to finding community cookbooks to add to the library's collection?
Well, I would say that it was more challenging turning down the tremendous number of gift collections and dealer listings that we were constantly being offered, because in spite of the fact that, you can get recipes off the New York Times cooking app now, and there are umpteen gazillion other resources online for getting recipes. People still love community cookbooks. And as Angela, her book exemplifies, it's something tourists pick up to buy for taking back home as a memento of a place they visited, or it's just a point of pride for the people who prepared it. And people love buying them or collecting them, regardless of the fact that they have all these other resources. And individual collectors began to pose challenges for me, because they began to be very interested in the historic community cookbooks. And I often found that I had to act very quickly when a dealer's catalog arrived so as not to be scooped by private collectors. And so I became very adept at getting dealers to hold things for me while I did my due diligence of searching and considering how important this book would be to the collection. Also, the prices were beginning to push higher and higher. So those were some of the challenges I faced. And finally, I'll also mention that these books also pose challenges due to their physical condition. A lot of the older books, the spiral or plastic comb bindings, were very difficult to deal with in a library setting. And a lot of those books that had been used in people's homes and then were being sold by dealers. So they were not brand new copies, they were used copies. And they actually had food stains in them, which can attract insects or degrade the book paper. So those are some other challenges. But another big challenge for me was staying focused on my work and not getting sucked into reading the recipes, some of which were very entertaining. And I'm just getting hungrier and hungrier as this panel goes on, just thinking about all these delicious recipes Angela's been talking about.
Oh my gosh. Yes, that's the hard part of cataloging some of these too. You just get kind of caught up in the recipes and you're like, what the heck is that? Or if something looks really good, or if there's
Yeah,
just like an intriguing little story about how the recipe came out.
right,
But in the exhibit, we do have a whole section of books that have been written in and with food stains all over them.
right.
Love a used cookbook. It's just like the best thing. There's so much history just right in there of like what's the favorite recipe or anything like that. So we perfectly ended all of our questions from me. So right now we're going to pause briefly to see some images from the exhibition we've been discussing, and then we'll return to address audience questions. And I see there's already a whole heck of a lot. All right, thanks. All right. So now we're going to take questions from the audience. If you have a question, again, please submit it using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Sorry, I'm just going through, there's so many questions. There's a lot of different questions. Let's see. I get one that I'll just address directly. One of them just says, when digitizing these cookbooks, how do you handle the copyright issues? We don't regularly practice digitizing most of our materials. We have thousands and thousands of books. And again, yeah, copyright is a thing that we can't just like digitize the whole book or anything. If we digitize stuff like that are published materials, it's usually stuff that's going to be out of copyright or things that have preservation issues. And those would be password protected or something like that. But yeah, in general, we aren't digitizing these community cookbooks largely due, well, resources and other things, money, but yeah.
I'll just add that there is a major digitized collection at Michigan State University and also at Virginia Tech and a couple of other places where they've digitized books that are before the date that's the current copyright cutoff. I can't remember what it is. It's 75 years, right, Erin?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is some, Schlesinger has not had a project specifically for community cookbooks, but we have digitized a whole lot of other stuff. So the library did digitize. I say we, but I'm retired, so forgive me. But yes, you do have to be really careful with the copyright issues when you're digitizing.
Just like another one that's like touching on this, and given the digital nature of many recipes and the seemingly endless availability of recipes online and through social media, do you think this is the future of what do you think the future of community cookbooks such as these? Will there continue to be a market for paper cookbooks, or will they convert to digital versions? I'll just like briefly answer this really quickly in that there's at least 3 major community cookbook publishers still working in physical forms. They've been around for a couple of decades. We get new ones. We get new ones all the time. So people are still doing them. People still do like physical books. Angela, do you think you would do a digital version of the cookbook?
I really cannot answer that because we have kept between us and the League of Women's Voters, so it's not something, it's just total us. We have the copyrights and we can do whatever we want. Everything has to always be between the 2 organizations, which, as I said, we have a great relationship. But what's happened on their side is just like on our side. Most of the people who were there then, they're very up in age, and they're trying to pass the torch to another group. But I believe it would be like if they did that, I'm sure that it would be the whole thing to the Gloucester Fisherman's Wife, because we still have very active group. We're trying, just this past year, we're really trying to convince younger women to become part of it, who their father was a fisherman or grandfather was a fisherman, or they're still fishing. And there's a little enthusiasm of them. We've got a few of them to get involved because, marketing, the young people, they know how to use computer like nobody else, and they can do so much in advertising. And like I said, the cookbook opens the door to the rest of the issue with the fishing industry.
This is another one for you, Angela. What is the most popular recipe in the cookbook, and what is your personal favorite?
The most popular, it's the fish puffs, we call it, because they're pieces of fish like a string potato, and we dip them in a batter that we make, and we fry them, and they get nice and puffy. In the middle there is the fish, and that goes all the time. As well as in today's, we have like the monkfish soup, redfish soup. We know the way life is today versus then. we find very way to use this, not to make it complicated. First, because when you add too much ingredients, you lose the fish taste. And then realizing, that we're all the same, we go to work, we come back, and that not every night I'm ready to cook a full meal. So what we recommend to people is, if you get fish and you want to preserve it, just get a little aluminum trays, breaded the fish, put it in the tray, put them in your freezer. When you have nothing to cook, open up your freezer, start your oven, and you will have a dinner or a lunch that you cannot find anywhere else.
This one's for Marylène. I think you're probably the best one to answer this. There's been a couple questions about whether community cookbooks are uniquely American, or were they in other countries? Are they universal?
Well, I haven't actually investigated that formally, but I have family in France and Italy, and I've never seen anything like it there. Probably because, the sharing of recipes between people there would maybe be a little more complicated than it is in America. People guard their family secrets very carefully, and everybody knows the basics. It's like when Julia Child started trying to promote French cooking in America, she found that the person she was working with, Simone Beck, who was French, would write out a recipe by saying, make a white sauce, then do this and this and that. And Julia would throw her hands up and say, but American women don't know how to make a white sauce. They need the recipe for that also. So the recipe suddenly gets very, very long because the basic cooking knowledge wasn't there. Whereas in European cultures, it tended to be handed on and everybody knew those basics. And also there wasn't as much of a need for that kind of fundraising there because there's so much more government support of some of the institutions that in this country individuals have had to raise money for. So I haven't seen that combination of efforts very much over there, although I may be completely wrong. I'm basing what I'm saying on a very limited sample of three countries. I've spent a lot of time in England too, and I don't see this happening over there that much. Maybe on a much smaller scale, if at all.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the examples that we have. We do have several international cookbooks here, going back, several decades or like century, but mostly those are like American wives of like people working in India or China or other places. So it's still like very American in that way. We do have a Scottish cookbook in this collection, in the exhibit, and that one is just from Scotland. So but yeah, I haven't seen that in coming across the history, because usually like all the ones that I've researched in the research that I did have all been like American publications, so they haven't talked about that.
Right. So I did find a number of Mexican ones.
Oh yeah.
So, there was obviously some of that going on in this hemisphere, perhaps, that filtered out from America or whatever. But it does seem to be a peculiarly American thing.
Oh, we got a fun question for Angela here, and it relates to some stuff we have in the exhibit. They just say, I want to hear more about community events and grocery store events held by the fishermen wives. What are they like? Who does them? And do they cook from the book? Because I know we have pictures in here from the Danvers Market Basket from like the 80s. I think it's amazing.
Yeah. When they opened the first Market Basket store, it's in Danvers, about 20 minutes from home. And they were new into the community, and they wanted to do all that they can to also help the community. So we will get the fish from the boat 99 times. We will create our own ingredients, and we put something together, like I said earlier, the fish puffs. they always go and the big fish fast. People come back for second or they come back for third time. And the need is there. What I mean the need is there is that we need to feed people because it's our responsibility in doing so, because our men can go out and provide. And as people have said, oh, you're always complaining, this, that, and everything. But the truth is, we are not complaining for us. We are complaining to save the resource that are out there. And the battle that we have right now is like the offshore windmills that they just want to put them in the fishing grounds. And once that happens, it's done. There is no going back into any of this. So we're really taking it seriously. As we did back then was to help people to learn how to eat the fish. But now it's more like we want to make sure that we still have the fishing grounds. Because if we don't, we cannot bring the food to the docks. You know, and it been very recently when this thought came in my mind at the fact that we have, and it was I think 2 years ago when Gloucester did 400 years. Remember, I came out and said Gloucester has fed the world for 400 years. And everything like that just clicked in that we have that responsibility to the windmills, clean energy, that's fine. We have nothing wrong with that, but not where we are providing food. We are exchanging one wealth for another, completely different thing.
I think we have time for one more question. So I'm just trying to, there are so many questions. It's hard to figure out. Let's see. There's one that's kind of interesting about how do illustrations and visual art contribute to the cultural value of community cookbooks beyond the recipes themselves. There's so many ones that are my favorite ones, and I know, Marylène, you're probably going to say one of these too, where the children have done illustrations of them, and then they've signed them with their name and age, and those are just so, I think those are just so wonderful. And then they just show like these are the people who you're raising money for, as like the kids, and this is like the PTA cookbook and things like that. What do you both think about this question?
All right. There are very few of them have photographic material in them. So the ones that I saw that were illustrated were mostly hand-drawn illustrations and frequently done by children, but also by adults. But there are also a large number of them, and you have a couple of great examples in the exhibit of handwritten books that are then it's duplicated, but you know the pages with the recipes on them are in different handwritings, which is a really kind of wonderful thing, although you know it can make it hard to follow the recipe in the kitchen in a way. And you have one that's actually done in calligraphy, which is really easy to read and beautiful to look at too. But the majority of the books that I saw were, you know, the older ones were produced on typewriters. So you have, you know, all those old typewriter fonts and things like that, and maybe an occasional drawing. But I think the handwritten ones have a lot of maybe cultural associations too. It's just it was a you know very low production value type of publication. Very basic, very simple, and not like published cookbooks with illustrations and all sorts of you know images of the landscape around where the recipe comes from or whatever. It's a much more basic type of publication.
But if I connect to the Gloucester, the Taste of Gloucester inside as figures and artwork, because that we are not just cook fish, but we're also teaching them how to clean a fish.
Mm.
And that is designed, into the book, and to identify the different species and in pictures and some, artwork. And
that's a very special book.
It is. And I really
really
think
is. Yeah.
when we put the 2-page with the story of the Gloucester Fisherman's Wife and then the League, I really feel that is what we've been able to sell the book this since the last time that we printed so fast, because people now want to know the real story of Gloucester Fisherman's Wife, not just the cookbook, but what are they doing? And the same for the League of Women's Voter. So it's attracted a different audience to buy the cookbooks.
Some of the older books would have a photograph of the church that was being supported by the cookbook, or the building, the hospital, or whatever. Old, grainy photographs.
Right. So I am going to, we're going to conclude, right? We're right on time. This concludes our program today, and I want to thank you very, very, very much to Angela Sanfilippo and Marylène Altieri for their terrific conversation, and our audience for their thoughtful questions. And I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them. So today's program has been recorded and will be posted in about a week. We encourage you to visit the exhibition Cooking Up Change in the Portview Gallery at the Schlesinger Library to learn more about these wonderful community cookbooks. It is open now through January 8th, 2027. Links to register or to request a group tour on the exhibitions page. And soon there'll be kind of a virtual exhibit up there as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for attending today. And yeah, please come see the exhibit.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, thank you so much for including me.